Okay, I think we are live now on YouTube and on Zoom. I know we have some people trickling in. Good morning. My name is Jalen Radzaminski, and I am the Communications Manager for the Bazlon Center for Mental Health Law. We thank you all for tuning in with us to reimagine inclusion, equity, and opportunity in schools with us today on the anniversary of Olmsted. Before we get started, I would like to just do some accessibility check-ins. And for those of you on Zoom, you should have the option to turn on captioning below in the More section. And we also have ASL interpreters, Andy and Lena, they'll be switching off. So if you're on the Zoom, please feel free to pin them for your view. And we also, again, have a YouTube live stream happening. And for Zoom audience members, please make sure to keep your videos turned off and to stay on mute, just to make sure the speakers and interpreters are easier to find and pin. So I'll just give everyone a moment to be able to find that if they need it. Wonderful. And once again, thank you all for joining us for this important conversation and call to action. Historically and during COVID-19 pandemic, students with disabilities, especially BIPOC students, are disproportionately segregated, punished, and policed in school settings. The pandemic has challenged school systems to be more flexible in restructuring the way education is delivered, including by using strategies that would previously have seemed impossible. Today, you will hear about the work the Bazlon Center is doing in this arena, a federal address from Monique Dixon from the U.S. Education Department Office of Civil Rights, as well as from an amazing panel of students, family members, educators, advocates, and other stakeholders across the nation to regroup and reassess what education looks like, both in person and online. When students are included and receive equal educational opportunities, it makes our school system better. After the panel, we will have a Q&A session. And we ask if you're tuning in on Zoom and live stream to feel free to submit your questions in the chat, and we will make sure to go through them after the panel at the end. So without further ado, just to kick today off, I would like to introduce Ira Burnham, the legal director for the Bazlon Center. He'll speak briefly about our work in education. So welcome, Ira. Let's see. Try now, Ira, are you unmuted?
Yep.
There we go.
Thank you. Hi, and good morning. I'm Ira Burnham, Legal Director of the Bazlon Center. I hope to set the stage for today's panel discussion by briefly describing the Center's education work. From its outset, the Center has fought to secure a quality education for children with disabilities. Our work focuses mainly on children with mental health disabilities, although our litigation and policy victories help all children with disabilities and children without disabilities as well. There are good reasons for the priority we give our education work. A good education is fundamental to success and a full life as an adult. Children with disabilities spend much of their day in school and should get the services they need to succeed in school. Also, we know that many of our schools are failing low-income students and students of color, among whom students with disabilities are disproportionately represented. And tragically, many schools have very low aspirations and expectations for students with disabilities, provide them inferior instruction in segregated settings, and subject them to arbitrary and discriminatory discipline. Our litigation and policy advocacy helped secure the passage of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the IDEA, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. Recently, we played an instrumental role in the Andrew case in the Supreme Court, which raised expectations on school systems for educating children with disabilities. We advocate and sometimes work in close collaboration with the U.S. Department of Education, often hand in hand with the broader civil rights and disability communities. After years of litigation to shape and enforce the ADA's Olmsted obligation, we launched a series of cases designed to secure its implementation in the education system. Convinced that separate education is, in the words of the Brown versus Board of Education decision, inherently unequal, we sought to require schools to be more inclusive of and to better educate students with disabilities. As a result of one settlement, Narelle Joyner, one of our panelists, has worked closely with Montgomery, Alabama to improve its education of students with mental health needs. A settlement in another case commits the state of Ohio to improving in 11 large urban school districts the percentage of students who achieve academic proficiency and the percentage of students included in regular classrooms, so that those percentages are consistent with the percentages in the rest of the state, including the suburbs. Another settlement commits Pasadena, California, to putting into effect a set of recommendations developed by an impartial expert. We continue to work on litigation in Georgia, Oregon, West Virginia, and New York City, seeking to achieve similar results. In our cases, we work with local and national partners, including law firms. We still have a long way to go. The education system is a hard nut to crack, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about and resistance to the notion of providing individualized instruction and supportive services to students with disabilities, who all too often are seen as undeserving or not worth the investment. What lies ahead? How can we make better progress? These are matters our panelists will explore as they help us to reimagine inclusion, equity, and opportunity in our schools. And now back to Jalen.
Thank you so much for all of your advocacy and just sharing with everyone today, Ira. Next, I am very excited and honored to welcome Monique Dixon, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy in the U.S. Education Department Office of Civil Rights, who will give us a federal agenda address. Welcome, Monique.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Great, and good morning to everyone. Again, I'm Monique Dixon, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy at the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights, and I am honored to be with you for today's Olmstead in Education event. 22 years ago today, the U.S. Supreme Court held in Olmstead versus LC that the unjustified institutional segregation of individuals with disabilities is a form of unlawful discrimination under Title II of the Americans with Disability Act. This landmark decision literally opened the doors of opportunity to many people with disabilities who were able to live and work in their communities, thereby offering the most integrated environment that would meet their needs. But today, an integrated educational environment for many students with disabilities, particularly students of color, remains out of reach. I would like to take a few minutes to share what the Education Department is doing to ensure that all students, regardless of race, color, or national origin, have educational access to high quality general and special education instruction. I just want to start with a little bit of background about the Office for Civil Rights. The mission of the office, also known as OCR, is to ensure equal access to education and to promote educational excellence through vigorous enforcement of civil rights in our nation's schools. We carry out this mission by enforcing several civil rights laws, including Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which prohibits discrimination based on disability, and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that prohibits discrimination based on race, color, and national origin. Also, OCR shares with the U.S. Department of Justice compliance responsibilities for Title II of the Americans with Disability Act with respect to most public education systems. So our jurisdiction is broad. OCR's enforcement strategies include investigating and resolving complaints filed by the public relating to educational discrimination matters, including discrimination against students with disability, And we also issue policy guidance and provide technical assistance documents to increase schools and school districts' understanding of their civil rights obligations, and to help students and parents become more aware of students' civil rights. Finally, since 1968, through the Civil Rights Data Collection, OCR has collected and disseminated civil rights data about educational opportunities for students in our nation's schools, including students' access to courses, programs, and staff. And we also look at school climate factors, such as student discipline and the use of restraint and seclusion. So that's the background about OCR. What have we been up to since the Biden administration? On day one of the Biden administration, the president issued several executive orders directing federal agencies to review their policies and practices through an equity lens. Executive Order 14,000 relating to the reopening of schools during the COVID-19 pandemic required the Education Department to issue a report on the disparate impacts of school closures and transitions to remote learning during the pandemic. And we wanted to measure the impact on our nation's students. Earlier this month, the department released the report. It's entitled Education in a Pandemic, and I encourage you to review it at your leisure. In the report, we found issues that we have seen before in our enforcement activities. Disability discrimination complaints that were filed with OCR highlighted many of the problems that we have also seen present themselves during the pandemic. For example, as the report indicates, there's evidence of schools failing to provide students with disabilities a free, appropriate public education and related services or aids as required by Section 504 and by the Individuals with Disabilities Act. Schools are excluding students from educational opportunities because of their disability. And schools continue to use restraint and seclusion or discipline students due to behavior relating to their disability. To address these issues, and to ensure that students are provided a free, appropriate public education during the pandemic, in May, OCR released a document entitled Questions and Answers on Civil Rights and School Reopening in the COVID-19 Environment, which details schools and school districts' continued obligation to ensure that eligible students with disabilities receive special education and other services, either in person and or remotely during the pandemic. And also the department has understands how important it is to make sure that school districts have the financial resources to support all students and also students with disabilities. So we recently released a frequently asked questions document that explains how state and local educational agencies may use the American Rescue Plan Act and other funding sources to meet the needs of students, including students with disabilities. As you know, students with disabilities, particularly students of color, have been more likely to be subjected to inappropriate use of restraint or seclusion and discipline, including referrals to law enforcement, when compared to students without disabilities. In an effort to address these problems, OCR has done, and will continue to do the following. We're taking steps to improve our civil rights data collection process to ensure that schools accurately report their use of restraint and seclusion. And we will continue to remind schools that the inappropriate use of restraint or seclusion could result in a denial of a free, appropriate public education to students with disability, and is a form of discrimination. And consistent with President Biden's executive order, OCR is reviewing current policies regarding the non-discriminatory administration of school discipline. This month, our office issued a request for information soliciting data, research, and other information that will inform OCR's efforts to address disparities in school discipline and improve school climates. I encourage each of you to please submit comments, which are due by July 23rd of this year. We also know that students of color have been both over-identified and under-identified as students with disabilities who need special education and related services or aids. In 2016, the Office for Civil Rights released a Dear Colleague letter on preventing racial discrimination in special education. And we encourage you to use that in your state and local advocacy efforts to remind schools and school districts of their obligation to provide special education services in a non-discriminatory way. So I've mentioned just a few of the policy priorities of the Education Department relating to students with disabilities. And please know that we welcome feedback on these and other issues. Please do not hesitate to reach out to OCR to share your concerns and thoughts. Thank you so much for all that you do every day, and I hope you enjoy today's event.
Thank you so much, Monique, for that wonderful address and really to set up the conversation today in the context of our country. Now I'm extremely excited to bring forward our panelists. As an organization that has advocated for students K through 12, undergrad and graduate students, the Bazlon Center values bringing together federal agencies, stakeholders, lawyers, advocates on the ground, and those directly impacted to reimagine what education should look like for the integration and inclusion of students with disabilities, especially BIPOC students. On today's panel, we have Kristen Harper, Director of Policy Development and Outreach at Child Trends, Narelle Joyner, Consultant and Settlement Agreement of GP et al. Versus Montgomery, Alabama Public Schools, Ebony LaBoy, MPH candidate for Rollins School of Public Health at Emory, Marvin Mitchell, Consultant for the Urban Collective and formal special education administrator for J.P. Manning Elementary School in Boston, Massachusetts, and Katie Simmons, the second grade teacher at J.P. Manning Elementary School in Boston, Massachusetts. So to kickstart our panel today, I like to frame the first question around what is the scope of inequities in schools and what actions have people like policymakers, educators, and students taken to address it. We'll also discuss what needs to still be addressed. So I'll point my first question to our panelist, Kristen. What do we know about what does the data tell us about disproportionate impacts in our school system?
Good morning, Jalen, and happy to be here. The data tells us quite a bit about the extent of disparity out there. If you look at OSEP's own data, we know that as of 2018, and just looking at placement, we know that about 64% of children with disabilities between the ages of 6 and 21 spent at least 80% or more of their day in a regular classroom. So what does that mean? 80% or more of their day in the regular classroom. We typically look at that type of placement as an inclusive placement. Now, at the same time, we know that 13% of students with disabilities spent their day in the regular classroom less than 40% of the day. And so when we look at students spending less than 40% of their day in the regular classroom, we tend to think of that as a relatively restrictive or segregated type placement. We often will call that often the students in a self-contained classroom. And then we still have 5% of students that are in separate settings altogether. They're receiving homebound instruction. They're in a separate school, a residential facility, a correctional facility, sometimes in a place in a private school, sometimes by their own parents. But over the last 10 years, we've seen a slow increase in the use of inclusive settings, but still only 64% of students are receiving what we would call inclusive instruction just as of now. And we do see some disparities by race in the use of segregated settings. About over 15% of Asian, Black, and Hispanic students are in self-contained classrooms compared to 10% of white students and American Indian, Alaska Native students. And, as we heard earlier from Monique, we continue to see really wide disparities in the use of discipline, both for children with disabilities and children of color with disabilities. In any given year, we tend to see, 5 to 6% of children receiving an out-of-school suspension. For children with disabilities, that percentage tends to double. So we tend to see closer to 11% children with disabilities receiving an out-of-school suspension. And then for children of color with disabilities, particularly our boys, that number doubles again. So, generally you see around a quarter of, male children of color with disabilities receiving at least one or more out-of-school suspension. So quite a bit of disparity we're seeing out there in the data.
Thank you so much for breaking that down for us, Kristen. When you said about 60% still, I was just like, wow. Next, I'm going to bring up Ebony LaBoy. She is our student on the panel today. Ebony, what are your thoughts from a student perspective on what still needs to be addressed in our school systems?
Hi, everyone. So I think that there's a lot that can be addressed as a student, like from a student perspective. I do have some experience of like working in a charter school. So in between undergrad and me getting my master's, I definitely seen both sides from like, I was like a teacher's assistant. But from that perspective, but then also from a student perspective, because I was a student with a disability when I was in elementary, middle school, and high school. And so I feel like it really just depends on the school. It's really hard to like say as a student because there's so many types of schools. You have the public school, you have charter schools, and then you have private schools. With the question being like, is the unnecessary segregation of students with disabilities, especially those of color, still a problem? It's really hard to say like from a student perspective. I personally haven't seen that happen much. But based off the data that we just heard, I'm sure that that definitely is, still an issue.
Thank you for sharing your perspective, Ebony. And then next I'll bring up Katie in about just so she could share what her experiences are as a teacher to answer the question, is the unnecessary segregation of students with disabilities, especially those of color, still a problem?
Good morning. So from a teacher's perspective, I would say that I do think it's still a problem. There are a lot of kind of similar to what Ebony just said, like it obviously varies from school to school, district to district, even state to state. But for the most part, like within my experience, I do find that Black and Brown students tend to be misrepresented, but also really misdiagnosed in terms of thinking about being overrepresented in the special education system. I think that it has a lot to do with the fact that there are so many different factors that kind of contribute to this. So thinking about students that are misrepresented, they're like, for instance, they could have a lot of environmental factors that kind of show up in the classroom and think about like, well, the student is struggling, academically, but then you're not thinking about what their home life is like and how that plays a really big impact in like what happens in the classroom. And so sometimes they are, labeled as like, having a learning disability when really there have been gaps in their learning, not necessarily because there's a struggle there developmentally, but mainly because they haven't been in school because, something's going on at home. So I think that from a teacher's perspective, it's really important to look at the child as a whole and make sure that you're considering all the factors when you do something as serious, like, as like making, as labeling of them with a student as a disability. Because, in my experience, I've had students that were labeled as such and didn't necessarily have the disability that they were given. And then, you know, it takes years for them to kind of like get out from under that. And sometimes their placement is changed, and that also like affects the trajectory of their life. So I think that seeing it from the ground up, there are a lot of things that still need to be worked on in terms of making sure students are identified correctly.
Thank you so much, Katie. And I wanted to call Kristen back up because I know she really broke down that data to set it up for us today. I was gonna have a follow-up question for you, Kristen, after just hearing a student and a teacher on what has been done to address this so far. Maybe examples from the Department of Education during the Obama administration, or any trends you may have seen.
I do think the Andrew v. Douglas ruling is absolutely huge. That was mentioned earlier. And the reason why I think that matters so much is, you know, really pushing schools to rethink what an appropriate IEP is. I think part of the move towards inclusive classrooms really requires us to rethink, like, what is the suite of services and supports that is due to a child with disabilities, you know, under IDEA's guarantee of a free, appropriate public education. And that ruling made clear that it's not, that promise is not just any old education programming. It's the programming that a child needs to make progress, and that includes programming that provides children the opportunity to meet challenging objectives. A rigorous education program. But one thing about that ruling that I think many people don't think about is it's often, when I hear about it, they'll talk about the academic implications of it, and we'll often miss the behavioral implications. And many times when we see children placed in separate settings and in segregated settings, it's often due to perceived, concerns with respect to their behavior. And so I think the ruling is incredibly important to help us think about, we heard earlier that, it depends upon the school. Well, as we're rethinking school culture, as we're rethinking what is an appropriate response to a child's behavior, let's be rethinking what kind of behavioral supports actually belong in that IEP to support a child's, success in classrooms alongside their peers without disabilities.
Thank you, Kristen. And now I want to kind of get Marty and Kadian's perspective on what has been addressed at the Manning School in your experiences, maybe as a case study.
Well, before we get into that, I just want to make a couple of comments. One is that the expectations that students have when they come into school, students, particularly those with emotional impairments, are often bounced from school to school. They get kicked out of the school, they get kicked out of that school, and they begin to, believe that they are their behavior. So one of the more powerful things that we found was changing that expectation and trying to build a new narrative for the student. So when, for example, now make no mistake about it, the students with emotional impairments, can be aggressive, quite aggressive, and they can be scary. But as the grown-ups, with master's degrees and PhDs and everything else, we got to be able to help students figure this out. And I had a student once who, he did something, and brought him to my office, and we started to go off. Call my mom, suspend me. And I said, well, I'm not going to suspend you. He says, well, that's what you're supposed to do. Well, that was an opening to begin changing the student's idea of himself and his narrative, so that no, we're gonna stay here and we're gonna figure this out. And I think that when students with, particularly those with emotional impairments, go into substantially separate programs. I ran substantially separate programs for 20 years at the elementary, the middle school, and the high school level. And it takes me a while sometimes to figure things out, but after 20 years, I figured out it wasn't working. It, however, it was working for somebody. It was working for the school because they get to kick a kid out. It works for the teacher because they don't have a disruptive student in the classroom and they can send the student to a specialist to help them figure things out. But it is highly detrimental to the student. And the ironic thing is, the classroom environment that embraces a student with emotional impairments, reducing their perceived level of threat, making them feel welcome, is exactly the kind of therapeutic environment that the students need to begin to thrive. And that's what happened at the Manning School. We didn't start to grow until we dismantled our substantially separate program, put those resources in throughout the building into the general education classroom. So we have a special educator and a general educator and a teaching assistant in each class. And the students who would have been in a substantially separate program, 32 of them were in regular classrooms. Our teachers of students, particularly those with emotional impairments, have to be experts at academics and at behavior. And getting the values straight for the adults is like the first thing to do. Why are you here? And explicitly stating those values and being able to integrate those values into routines and policies and procedures and celebrations throughout the school gives students that continuous feedback of reinforcement that they need to begin making a new narrative. And when we're at our best, we are literally changing students' brains, because the effects of traumatic experiences for students, especially young students, is staggering. And the CDC and the has done a lot of work on this, and there's the ACEs project. And this is, these are students, it's not just their social environment, but students who are homeless have experienced flood, hurricane, fire, tornadoes, all kinds of things. So building a school that addresses the needs of students who have the greatest needs, that's the place to start for improving the outcomes for students, particularly students with emotional impairments, but all students with disabilities, and it makes everybody better.
Thank you so much for that. Katie, do you have anything you would like to add? I saw in the comments, a lot of people really resonated with the points of the student not only being their behavior, and a lot of people really liked when you were explaining dismantling the substantially separate program, and that's how you started to grow. I'm just taking a look at the chat and some responses, but Katie, did you have anything you wanted to add about Manning and how you all have advocated in that environment?
Yes. I kind of want to echo Marty's sentiments in terms of like the thing that I think we do really well at the Manning is looking at the student as a whole and thinking about how they contribute to the classroom community just as much as any other student, because I find that, you know, very similar to what Marty said, the students are bounced around from school to school and they kind of feel like they don't have a place. And I think that at the Manning, they feel like this is their home, they found their place. And I think that's really important in terms of building a student's like self-worth. And I think another thing there that we do really well is thinking about inclusion as a whole and what does it actually mean to be inclusive. As Marty like pointed out, it's not just one teacher in charge of thinking about like all the needs of all the different types of students in the classroom. It's there are two teachers and an assistant, and that fundamental like setup of sharing the work is really important, because, you know, like I've taught in a classroom where it's just me, and, you know, being a teacher sometimes feels like an island where it's like you really just kind of like focus, and it's like all the work is on you and you're thinking about like what can I do for my students. And, you know, being kind of like in that co-teaching model really helps to build the collaboration and really makes people think about like what else they can do to help all the students succeed. And I think that's really important. That's like one more really important thing that I wanted to like highlight about the Manning as well.
Thank you,
And,
Katie.
and students do a lot of the heavy lifting for the social emotional learning part, because once they own their classroom and own their environment, they can help each other regulate their behavior and their responses. I mean, one of the one of the best situations I encountered was, okay, kids acting out in class, and they call me and said, okay, come on, let's go take a break. And he was, you know, he was being a little argumentative and confrontational, and his classmates said, just go ahead and do it and get back here because we need you. And that just clicked. And when students have a feeling that they contribute and they are competent, then the classroom becomes theirs, and they will want to use the classroom and each other to help improve each other.
Great points there. And I'm also seeing in the chat bringing the students to the table so that they're also included. Very great points. And you all are inspiring a couple of folks in the chat as well. And I wanted to bring in Narelle about, from her perspective, what should happen as part of special education to address inequities in schools.
Good morning again. I think it's a lot that can happen to address special education in the schools. And I want to start with saying, yes, I agree that there is a disproportionate amount of students still being served separately. I also think that it's a huge community issue. It's housing, it's legal, it's mental health. It's the whole broad community, including the schools, that need to come together to address the needs of special ed students. I think there's this misunderstood child and youth who they don't always respond behaviorally to the timeline of the authority figures, the teacher, the police, the recreation center directors. And because they don't respond within that timeline, they are put out of settings. So they are put out of all environments because of their behavior. And one of the most important things that I think has to happen is that we all have to educate ourselves holistically. Katie and I agree with you wholeheartedly that we have to understand the whole child. We have to become knowledgeable about who they are within their own culture, within their home, within the school, within the church, in the recreation centers. We have to be able to identify what their needs are And then we have to be able to match and develop services that actually meet those needs. So there, in terms of a collection of data, Kristen, I think one of the things that the schools tend to miss is they set up a system of service based on what might be the state of the art thing going on somewhere in the country or wherever, versus taking their individual data, looking at individual needs, collecting data per individual, and then forwarding that over to what that indicates for the system, and then developing services to meet those needs. And there will always be times when none of those services meet that need, and you have to develop something different, which drives you to the beauty of the development of a team to address the needs and concerns for every child in special ed.
Thank you so much for that. And I do see some people are also trickling in a little bit later. Just for an accessibility note, we do have Andy and Lena on here for ASL interpretation if you need it, if you would like to pin them to your chat. And we also have captioning live if you want to turn on that setting at the bottom. So just want to make that note as I saw some people come in. And I see in the chat, we're getting a lot of responses, some resource sharing and inspiration. I want to move on to the next question, the general question to our panel. How can we reimagine schools to include students with disabilities? And how can we ensure these strategies are culturally competent and free from bias? So I heard a couple of our panelists already alluding to that point. And as we're processing each other's comments in this conversation, I kind of wanted to open it up for us to imagine together. So first I'll start with Kristen. Just from the ruling guidance application perspective, how do you think we should reimagine schools to be more inclusive?
I think schools need to be able to take a big step back. The school districts need an opportunity to take a big step back and rethink both school culture and practice. There is at the under IDEA a provision, section 618D, requires that states have a standard approach for identifying school districts with large racial and ethnic disparities in the identification of children with disabilities, the discipline of children with disabilities, and the placement of children with disabilities. When a school district is identified by their state as having what we call significant disproportionality by race and ethnicity, they are required to set aside 15% of their IDEA Part B dollars to pretty much address the disparity, to provide coordinated, oh wow, I can't believe I'm forgetting my language. Comprehensive coordinated early intervening services. And those services have to address the root causes of the disparity. It is an opportunity for a school district to take that big step back. It does require reallocating dollars from their federal IDEA Part B pot to do so. But there is the funding that, given the disparity being there, take a moment, take a pause and think about what needs to shift in terms of culture, what needs to shift in terms of practice, what are the new skills that we need to be providing, to educators, to special educators and general educators, and what is the experience that we want to be providing, children with disabilities and children of color with disabilities.
Thank you for that. So I'm definitely hearing loud and clear, thinking about what we want to provide as we're creating these plans and initiatives. And I want to bring back Narelle, just from an administrator or school district perspective. What do you think we could do to reimagine?
Well, let me start by saying that over the course of time, I've met a lot of great and dedicated special ed teachers, special ed administrators, and principals who have made them a part of the school. But I've also encountered areas where that has not occurred. So I think one of the biggest issues is that principals' response and leadership to special education should be held to a higher standard across the board. I've had several to a lot of principals say, this is my territory. I run it the way I want to run it. And I feel that a lot of times special ed is working in a silo within the school, and they don't get the support that they need in order to implement services for students with special ed. I also feel that the schools should be monitored and praised or not praised for progression towards the achievement of IEP goals and held to a standard. When I go in and to different areas and I review IEPs, they can go years with the same IEP in place, with no progress, with no changes. And I think folks need to be held accountable for goals that they put on IEPs, whether or not students actually make progress. I also think that we have to train special ed teachers how to deal with all of what they have to deal with. We have to allow them to have adequate caseloads or adequate, a small number of students in that classroom so they can address all the issues, and provide them with adequate pay to make them stay in the classroom once they get there. I also think the schools need to provide some in-depth services that are readily available to students, as well as their families and teachers who might also need additional support within the schools. So I think that we have a lot to do in terms of reimagining and changing the culture. I was very pleased to hear Marty talk about the Manning School, and I'd love to come and visit your school and see you in Acadian at some point in time to experience that and feel that. So we know that it can happen. The biggest issue is streamlining a lot of this across the board within all schools and not allowing schools to act so separately when they address the needs of special education.
Thank you, Narelle. And I love how both you and Kristen's comments seem related to each other about thinking about the end experience. And I'm hearing your strong points also of accountability to those goals, but also celebration when things go right. And that is, I see, so important in different settings like this. And I wanted to bring forward Ebony again, our student. I know, Ebony, you're very involved in the Rollins School of Public Health, and just wanted to hear from your perspective, from a student perspective, how can we reimagine schools to be more inclusive of students?
So I'm really glad that Narelle and Kristen went right before me, because a lot of what I had to say aligned with what they were saying. I think that, educating teachers, all teachers, and not just special ed teachers, like through professional development, is like really important. Mainly because, special education teachers, that's their realm. So they know, it's just like if I was to be like in a public health setting, like that's my realm, that's what I know. But a school is a community. And so I think it's really important for all teachers to, have some sort of professional development on students with disabilities. because it could be something as simple as a student passing by a teacher saying something inappropriate that they shouldn't be saying about a student with a disability. And so I think that's why it's really important to just address it as a community, and for teachers to just know like certain things, just key points when dealing with students with disabilities. As a student, from a student's perspective, like no student should, have to deal with a teacher not being aware of their disability, or using that as an excuse to like say certain things or act a certain way towards a student. And then even like students as well. I do have a disability that is not as common. So I think that's another like standpoint, like just being aware that there are a lot of different disabilities. They're not all visible. They're not, there's no, okay, there are some that are more common than others, but just being aware that it's a broad spectrum. And so just because you may see a student that has a disability that you've never heard of, like, taking that initiative to understand what that disability is, and how to cater to that student. And like I was saying before, like educating students as well, so that they understand that, everyone's different. Because again, a school is a community, and it's just really important. I think Marty had mentioned like before how like, it's really good when like you feel a part of the school, and you feel like a part of that community sense is like really important as a student. And I believe someone mentioned before, just valuing the students' needs and wants. For me personally, like growing up, like I knew that I had an IEP, I knew that I had a 504. And I feel like it was because I was involved in that process in a sense. And it did take some time for me to get used to that language and understanding, what was a part of it, and being comfortable with using those accommodations. I'm a master's student right now, and I still, actually, I've just gotten to the point where, sorry, my brother waved at me. I just gotten to the point where I feel comfortable advocating for myself. And I feel like it's because part of it is because like I wasn't always a part of that process as a student. Like I was diagnosed when I was 8. And so growing up, like, knowing what a 504 and an IEP was okay enough for me, but just being able to be comfortable, I think like that comes from being involved in that process. And in undergrad, I really struggled with using the accommodations that were given to me because I didn't feel comfortable with my disability. So like, I just think it's really important to like keep the student involved as well. I feel like I'm talking a lot, but I think someone else mentioned as well, like as far as like with being culturally competent, and like free from bias, like that really has a lot to do with like in public health, we always talk about, involving the community that you're serving. And so when it comes to students with disabilities, involving them as a whole, I believe I read that in the comments, someone talking about the whole child. So the school, the family, their teachers, like involving all of that data when trying to address, the issues that are at hand.
Thank you so much for that, Ebony. You're getting a lot of love in the chat, and completely co-sign about the holistic teacher training that you all have been discussing at every level so that it's integrated, right? And the last person I want to ask to address this question is Kadian, our current teacher. And then we'll do our last question our last question for y'all a little bit quicker so we can give the audience some time to give some Q&A. Kadian, as a teacher perspective, how do you reimagine schools?
Well, first of all, I echo a lot of the things that everyone has already said. I think that also I wanted to give a shout out to Ebony. I think that you did a great job like explaining from like a student perspective, like how important it is to just be like involved in your own education. I think that you did a great job with that. But I also, really think that it's important. I think it was Narelle said something about like streamlining special education and what it looks like within schools and not having it be as individualistic as it is currently, because, one of the things I love to say is that, special education inclusion looks extremely different. And I think that that's actually a detriment because it has so many different meanings to so many different people that a lot of the times it ends up being misconstrued and not what's best for students. So I think that, really thinking that it's really important to make sure that the understanding, first of all, is a really good understanding. It can't just be like it's streamlined, but like it's still in the wrong direction. It has to be one that comes from thinking about what the child needs and how to benefit them. And then thinking about like how can it be something that's, message to all. So that's the one thing I would definitely add.
Thank you for that. And now we're on our final question. And I guess we'll do a little bit more of a shorter response to this, but really, I know you all are also involved at different levels. So the last question we have before we go into Q&A is, what can our communities and stakeholders do to end the unnecessary segregation of students with disabilities, especially BIPOC students in schools? So I'll start with Kristen. What would you tell Congress and the White House, the Hill? What would you tell them to do, Kristen?
I'm going to say something wildly surprising as a representative of a research institution is share the data. So we have an incredible treasure in the civil rights data collection, and that data set is always released in two formats. You have the public data set, and then you have the researchers data set. But that data is available. They typically release national and state numbers, but you can get that data down to the school district level and down to the school level. We have just as much of a treasure in the IDEA Section 618 data set. All of the data that I talked about at the beginning of this conversation comes from the IDEA Section 618 data set. However, as of right now, that data is only provided to the public in national and at the state level. Local level data exists, but it's not provided to the public in either sort of a public use format, and it's not provided to researchers in a restricted use format. Much of the rationale for that is probably that when you break the numbers down at the local level, you get to really, really small numbers. And there's always a concern about, student privacy. But that's exactly what a restricted use data set is for. We can't, fix challenges. We can't solve problems unless we're able to track how we're doing over time, unless we're able to delve into the data and ask questions of the data. And right now that data is mostly hidden from us. We're only able to look at the issue at a very, very high level, and we could do more. So I would say that probably one of the number of things we could do to just better understand this issue and where it's happening and when it's happening is to give researchers, ideally the general public as well, but let's start with at least giving researchers access to local level special education data.
For that. And Marty, what would you tell school administrators and school districts to do?
Oh, I don't know if they'd want to hear it. First of all, I'm a big fan of decentralized structures. So my idea is that the role of the district is to set the mission and the goal and the accountability frame, and then let schools innovate. Give school leaders and individual schools the resources to accomplish those goals, understanding what the accountability is, and then hold them accountable. The one of the big problems is that the district talks to principals and principals talk to teachers, but schools and principals and teachers don't talk to each other. And to be able to develop schools as networks that have a broad range of services that they choose, not that are imposed upon them because of space limitations, or or we have room over here for a new program, so that's where it goes, regardless of what else is going on in what else is available at the schools. The lack of coherency is huge in schools, and being able to have a school that has an aligned mission, that aligns its mission and its resources with the goals, is a pretty powerful institution. And right now, we don't have very much of that in public schools.
Thank you, Marty. Narelle, did you want to jump in on any thoughts on what schools and school districts and administrators should be doing?
Well, just to make a couple of points, I know we're crushing on time here. I think I'd love to see the culture change to IEPs being looked at by all as an opportunity versus a punishment sometimes within schools, and sometimes even by students. They view it as a punishment versus an opportunity. And to me, it's like, come on, now we got all these resources and we can make all these things happen with you and for you to benefit you and your family. And also, one of the areas that concerns me the most is the lack of accomplishment of core skills in the area of reading, writing, and math that happens with our special ed students. And I continue to see this drop of accommodations that people are adding on. So we'll give you all of these accommodations to help you read, to help you write, to help you learn how to do math, when they don't have those core skills at all. So nothing ever happens with progress in those areas. And the older they get, the more behaviors come out because they're being placed in regular classrooms where they're expected to read 8th grade material and they can't read at all. So I think we have to figure out a way to address making sure the core skills actually get achieved early on in life and not dropping accommodations to kids who do not have basic skills. We have to figure that out.
Thank you, Narelle. And I know we're getting closer to time. So Katie and Ebony, do you have any very brief call to action so we can give the audience some chance to do Q&A with us on what students should do or teachers should do?
I just had to say, like, quickly, it's not necessarily, I think, what teachers necessarily should do, but I think that it's important that in order to have students succeed the way that they should, teachers need support. And, thinking about making sure that if the student has, services on their IEP, they need to have those things being done. And so really making sure that, like, teachers have the people that they need in order to make sure that the child can do the best that they can. So that's what I would say is a push.
Yeah, and I would just add from like a student perspective, just teaching other students with disabilities to advocate for themselves. Like I was saying before, like understanding like what your IEP is, what's on there, what your 504 is, and feeling not only understanding what's on it, but just feeling comfortable with those accommodations and understanding that, like Narelle was saying, like those are resources to help you. It's not a punishment. And just feeling comfortable using them. Because like I was saying before, like I really struggled. Like I went like a whole semester, if not a year, without using mine in college because I just was so ashamed of having them. So just, trying to get students to understand them before they get to that point, before they get to college, because, the GPA is nothing to play around with. So yeah, just getting them to understand that and feel comfortable with that is what I would say.
And one more thing, if I can add, I think that teachers need to have the professional development so that they can translate those IEP goals into lesson plans that are culturally relevant, that build a culture of achievement for students. And that's a part that's missing, I believe.
Thank you so much for that, Marty and Ebony. Thank you all to all of our amazing panelists. I wanted to just give us time to open it up for Q&A because we had some questions submitted and they're very eager to hear your responses. And we'll first go through submitted questions. If we could try to keep answers as brief as possible, I can have time to maybe take a few more. Let's see here. We had one question from Betty Petty. How do we work with students to help and show them how to control their disability rather than the disability controlling them? What are your thoughts on that? And I'll open it for any panelists to jump in.
I'll go. I'll say it's a process. Yeah, like it's a process. I'm just getting comfortable with understanding what exactly your disability is. And then realizing that you are not your disability, you're just a person that has that disability. I think, you know, it may like range on like how severe the disability is, you know, and maybe having more intentional conversations about that if you feel like that student is really struggling with accepting having that disability. So yeah, that's what I would say. It is a process and there's no like right or wrong answer. But I think intentional conversations with the student could possibly help so that they understand that that's not their entire identity. It's just a part. It's just one part.
Well said, Ebony. I'd also like to say, and what you pointed out is to educate a child regarding their disability. Oftentimes children receive all sorts of diagnoses and they have no idea that they even have a diagnosis sometimes. And then they certainly don't always have the opportunity to understand what that diagnosis means. I also think it's really helpful to point out to students that, yes, you have this disability, but you also have all of these wonderful protective factors. You have all of these wonderful people in your life who care about you, and you have all these strengths. You might not be able to do science and get an A right now, but look at how well you sing or you draw or how good you are working with your hands. So I think we have to, it goes back again to understanding and being knowledgeable about the whole child and family so that you have access to those strengths and protective factors and can share that information.
I would also just jump into, I guess, ask that the audience also think about what it really means to create an inclusive space for all children. If our understanding of an orderly, productive school environment is students, in seats, eyes forward, silent and quiet, that is an incredibly restrictive, limited definition of what it means to be in a space of learning. So I would always be thinking about, how do we create, a physical space? How do we create a social space and the learning space that fits the full range, the full diversity of the students that are going to be coming in the door.
And I want to throw at least one more question out there for the panelists. And I think it's a very bold reimagining question that we received. Do you believe ableism is a reason why special education is treated separately in schools?
I think that I'm sure is part of it, but I also think that there are some like schools that think of special education as like the other, where it's like, this is one more thing that I have to make sure that like I'm checking off on the list of like, this is something that I have to do, as opposed to this is something that's important to make sure that the children that are in my charge are succeeding. And I think that when it has that type of environment, it obviously doesn't benefit the child. And I mean, in my experience, I found that tends to be more of the reason why it's treated in that way.
Ableism is definitely a part of what's going on, but I think it's useful to remember and have an understanding of the history of education in America, that Black and brown students were integrated into public schools at the point of a gun. And being able to create an environment in schools that is supportive for all students. It's not only a challenge, but schools weren't meant for us, and we have to literally, kick the door open and make them and own schools. Having more teachers who have diverse backgrounds would be a big help to providing students models of academic and social success.
Thank you all so much for those answers and just reimagining with us today. Thank you again to our panelists and audience members. I know we're getting short on time, so I would just like to bring up Bazlon Center's fearless leader, President and CEO, President Holly O'Donnell, to just give some quick closing remarks, and then we can wrap up today.
Thanks, Jalen. It's awesome to have an in-house facilitator like you. So my name is Holly O'Donnell, and I just want to let you know that I'm in my home on Capitol Hill that's painted yellow. I have on a black top, gold hoops, and I just chopped my brown hair that got a lot more gray during the pandemic. I also want to say a big thanks to our panelists, our staff, especially Jalen, Lewis, and Kathy, and our interns who helped put this event together. Like many of you, I've seen the success of inclusion as an educator and as part of a family that fought for inclusion 40 years ago. I'm proud to let folks know that the Bazlon Center is on the eve of our 50th anniversary in 2022, and we will continue our legal advocacy until children with disabilities are given the opportunities and services they need to succeed and excel alongside their peers. One thing that I always think about in these conversations is the amount of creativity that it takes from all of us. And so we know it's hard work, but really that we continue to be really creative to find new ways forward. And we also plan to have more of these discussions. So we'd love to hear, I know we didn't get to all the questions, but we'd love to hear from you about things that we can do that would be really useful. I think right now our website, social media handles are being dropped in the chat. You can always email me. I'm hollyo@bazlon.org. But again, thanks to all of you, and I will pass it back to Jalen.
Thank you so much for that, Holly. Again, and thank you everyone again for joining us today. It looks like we're at 12:15, so we like to do everything on time here. And one of our strategic comms interns did just drop our social media and our donation link in the chat. If you are able to donate, or if a simple follow and share of this event and all this information would be incredible. So they dropped that in the chat for those on Zoom and our Instagram. So thank you all so much again. I'll leave that chat open for a second so people can follow or share if they would like. And I hope you all have a great day. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jalen.
Thank you.